Boy, in 50 years of my life and 28 years of vocational ministry, which is hard to believe, I'm not sure I've been more excited about a year in front of us, and are just grateful and thankful for all of you who give and serve and are part of what's happening here at Fellowship Memphis. And so as we launch into the fall, let's ask the Lord to do big things. Well, we're in the book of Mark, which is one of the four Gospels, one of the four biographies of Jesus. If you've got a Bible, you can open it up. Got an app, you can open it up. What we're learning here in the first part of Mark is that Jesus is on the move. Jesus is establishing himself as the king. In the second song, we spoke of Jesus being strong and mighty, and that's exactly what he's showing us in these first parts of Mark. One of the ways I told you last week you might want to think about Mark, and the first part is Jesus establishing himself as king, and the second part is him taking on a crown, but not a crown of a king, but a crown of thorns. And so it begins with Jesus' establishment that he is God, and he's showing that through his power. It's going to end on a cross where he dies for us, then 3 days later rises again to defeat Satan, sin, and death, and promise to come back one day to rule and reign forever. The encounters we've got this morning, we're going to look at two of them, hopefully, will again continue to be Jesus showing his power, Jesus on the move. One commentator pointed out over 1,300 times the word "and" is found in the book of Mark. Again, I'm not going to count those. You're free to count those, but it's Jesus does this, and Jesus does this, and Jesus does this. And so other Gospels, Matthew, Luke, John, focus more on Jesus' teaching. Mark focuses more on Jesus' doing, his action. And so what he's going to do today is deposit a lesson into the life of the disciples. And so we're in Mark 4. We'll start there. And we're going to develop, or Jesus is going to develop in his disciples and in us, followers of Jesus Christ today, a storm theology. Now, I don't know about you, but I hate storms. A wise counselor helped me understand that's probably rooted in the fact that when I was in second grade, my little town in eastern Kentucky called Harlan went through a massive flood. It caught everybody off guard, and our whole city was, until things could be rectified and flood walls built after that big flood in 1977, we were petrified of another one coming. And sure enough, a year or two later, heavy thunderstorms came in. Everyone panicked. I'm probably in fourth grade at this time, and I remember our school system just let us go. The entire school system, probably not a best practice, was just basically head for the high ground. And I remember as a little 11, 12-year-old thinking, do I go get my younger brother? Do I wait for my older sister? Like, what do I do? And everybody's in a panic. And ever since then, 30, 40 years later, that's still to this day. I hear a little storm's coming. I see that red on the meteorologist. My heart starts to beat. But I don't like storms. Now, I definitely don't like storms at night. Like, that would make it like doubly awful. At least in the day, you can kind of see what's happening. I can't imagine a storm at night in the middle of the ocean, which is what the disciples are going to go through. And even more so, I can't imagine a storm at night in the middle of the ocean 2,000 years ago without radar and Q-beams and coast guards and at least some hope that somebody can come find you. But that's where we're going to find our disciples. So it starts in verse 35. It says, "On that day, when evening had come, he said to them, 'Let us go across to the other side.'" Now, on that day, if you were to look back in chapter 4, again, not surprising because we're in Mark, a busy day of ministry. So evening has come. He said to them, "Let us go over to the other side." Now, you're going to start to see a shift in this book from Jesus ministering to the masses, which he'll continually do, but the disciples kind of watching and helping, to Jesus starting to intentionally train the disciples. That most of what Jesus is doing from this point forth, beginning with our lesson today, is beginning to get those 12 disciples ready to carry the torch once Jesus returns to heaven. And it says, so this lesson, the us there is the disciples. Let's leave the crowds and let's us go over to the other side. Now that begs the question, the other side of what? And that would be the Sea of Galilee, pretty famous body of water. You can look at it a lot of different ways. I think it's has more species growing of more different kinds of fish and aqua life than any other body of water. A lot going on with the Sea of Galilee. But for our purposes, it's a unique place in that the Sea of Galilee sits 700 feet below sea level. And just to the north of it are mountain ranges like Mount Hermon that sit like 9,000 feet above sea level. So it is an amazing place, but there's a lot of rising warm air that hits a lot of cool air coming off that mountain, and it is just known for violent storms out of nowhere. Even today, 2,000 years later from our story, in the parking lot next to the Sea of Galilee, there's a sign that says, hey, you might not want to park here. Like, violent storms arise out of nowhere and can damage your car. Like that, you just didn't do this. And Jesus asking his disciples at night to go across the Sea of Galilee was a really big ask. This was a really scary thing. This was a very dangerous thing. And yet Jesus orchestrates this thing, this dangerous lesson, to teach them a deep heart lesson. And leaving the crowd, and watch the language of this, because you and I are going to get a picture. We can read the lines and between the lines to get a picture of the posture of the disciples' heart now that they're heading onto water. And leaving the crowd, they took him. The disciples took Jesus with them in the boat, and I love this phrase, just as he was. And other boats were with them, and they kind of fall off. But notice this posture. 7 of the 12 disciples were fishermen. These were men of the sea. These were men that had grown up on the Sea of Galilee, grown up on boats, fishing on the Sea of Galilee. And so though this was an awkward, dangerous request, you can begin to smell the arrogance and self-reliance from these disciples. Like, we got this. Like, you know, Jesus as a carpenter, you may have built boats, we sail boats. Like, that's what we do. And so you can start to feel that they're going to take over now and kind of take Jesus just as he was. And that's kind of how we are, isn't it? Like, there can be times where we just find ourselves with a bunch of self-reliance. Like, the marriage is going well until it isn't. Like, parenting's going well until you hear, like, my kid did what? The job's going well until it isn't. You know, market's doing awesome until it's not. Like, we are constantly surprised by storms, often in the area of our self-reliance and arrogance. It's a gift God gives us ultimately. That until that day we kind of are with him, are completely and totally reliant on him. And so this storm surfaces several things in the heart of these disciples, just like storms do for us. And a great windstorm arose. And think like hurricane-esque winds. That's in the original language. This isn't just a rain shower. This is a storm. And the waves were breaking the boat. And the boat was already filling up, so they couldn't bail fast enough. And you can imagine how terrifying this is. And in contrast to that, we get verse 38. But Jesus was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. Another sermon for another day, but I love the fact that if Jesus had the option for a pillow, he used it. Like, he's not a martyr. He doesn't have a martyr syndrome like some of us. Like, man, I'm so holy, I won't even sleep with the pillow. Jesus is like, no, give me the pillow, you know, and he's asleep. It's a detail we don't need, but it helps us understand this was an eyewitness encounter, probably Mark capturing Peter's eyewitness encounter. But nonetheless, in the midst of the storm and the disciples being scared, here Jesus is asleep. And notice it says they woke him, the disciples. They said to him, powerful phrase here, teacher, if you're a circler, circle that, because that's going to shift in a few verses. Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? So that's their prayer. That's how they approach Jesus. Teacher, that's all he is to them at this point. Do you not care that we're perishing? So they question his motives. Paul Tripp says, when you misunderstand God's agenda, you will often end up doubting his character. When you and I doubt the character of God, when you and I get scared in the midst of storms, we usually do one of two things. We'll doubt his goodness, like he is powerful enough to stop this event happening in my life or allow us to do this when we're not able to do it on our own. But he's not good, powerful but not good, doesn't care about me, doesn't know where I am, doesn't know what's going on in my life. Or just the opposite. He's a good God and he wishes things for me and he wants good things for me. He just can't intervene in the circumstances of my life. And I've got great news for you today that God is all powerful and all good. In fact, the collision of those things is God's providence, that he's at at work in and around our lives in 10,000 ways for our good, the good of others, and his glory. But we're not always going to be able to see all the pieces. Part of following Jesus is trusting him and establishing some gospel patience, that we don't see all the things in and around our lives the way God sees them. In fact, I would argue when we get to heaven and we look back at our life and we have all the facts God has, we would agree with the complete trajectory of our life, that God is sovereign over our lives. They turn to him, a pretty pitiful prayer, "Teacher, do you not care that we're perishing?" Yet God moves when they turn to him. It says, he awoke and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." 3 words. Like I would say to my 6-year-old, "Bane, sit down. Stop hitting your sister." Like just like a godly parent, 3 words, "Peace, be still." And here's the miracle. The wind ceased and there was a great calm. All right, this is Jesus just flexed. 3 words, storm goes away. Now that there might be a chance that's a coincidence, that Jesus just happened to stand up and the storm was done. Here's the miracle. The peace became perfectly calm. The waves stopped perfectly. All right, we had from a hurricane to a perfectly calm Sea of Galilee. There was a great calm. Now, one of the things I love about this is you can see God's grace dripping through this story. Jesus doesn't ask them, they turn to him. Here's how it doesn't read. Most of us, the legalist in us, the performer in us, the moralist in us, we would insert a verse between those 2 things. "Teacher, do not care that you're perishing." Then Jesus says, "How dare you just see me as teacher? And before I'll do anything for you, I need you." Anybody got any verses memorized? Let me see if you've memorized. So, okay, then memorize a few verses before I'm doing anything for you. Let's try that prayer again. Why are you doubting my character? Why are you doubting my goodness? Like, we don't see any of that. He moves as an act of grace. In spite of them, he acts on their behalf. So you see grace in the midst of them. And he says to them, "Why are you so afraid? Why do you still have no faith?" Or, "Where's your faith? What's your faith in?" And they were, verse 41, filled with a great fear. Storm scared them. Jesus being able to speak to the winds and the waves and make them perfectly calm terrified them. So much so, in contrast to teacher, as I ask you to think about, here's how it ends. "Who then is this, that even the winds and the sea obey him?" See, this storm moved Jesus from being just we'll take you just as you are, carpenter, teacher boy in our boat, to he is God. Like every molecule of the universe submits to him. Like he is that powerful. He is that mighty. It's 2,000 years later, we still haven't developed telescopes that can get to the end of his creation or microscopes that can get to the detail of his creation. Who then is this? So, what do storms teach us before we move on to our next encounter? Several things. We'll all face storms. Paul says that we'll all share in the sufferings of Jesus. James would say, brother of Jesus in James 1, "Consider it pure joy, my brother, when you encounter various trials," not if. Storms and trials for the life of a believer are part of the core curriculum. They're not an elective. We need a strong storm theology as a church family and as individual followers of Christ. What moves Jesus to action? It's the voice of his children. They just turn to him. In their mess, in their limited Christology, in their accusations of his character, they still turn to Jesus, not from him. And Jesus loved that and acted on their behalf and calmed the storm and saved their life. And so in the midst of a storm, you move to him, not from him. Even with your mess, even with your questions, even with our wonderings and doubts about the very character of God, we still turn to him. We learn Jesus has authority over all creation. There's not a single circumstance in my life or your life in which he does not rule sovereign. We learn that pain is a part of life, that until Jesus returns to make all things new or we die to be with him forever, pain and contending with pain and loss and suffering is going to be a part of our walk with God. You've heard me say it before. I say it to myself all the time. You get Genesis 1 and 2, call it the pinch test, the pinch reminder. Genesis 1 and 2, perfection. All is right in the world. Rev 19, 20, 21, Jesus comes back to make all things new, perfection. The rest of this big old thing is teaching us how to contend, how to walk with God, how to trust Him in the midst of a world full of brokenness and of pain. Trials have purpose. They produce in us a greater understanding of God, that we deepen our understanding of our relationship with Christ. This also teaches us no one's exempt from trials. Like in this boat is Peter, James, John, Andrew. That's like the Mount Rushmore of the New Testament. And they've left everything to follow Jesus. So understand, we don't hold to a prosperity theology that to declare Jesus and follow Him means that I'm just going to get richer and healthier and better looking the rest of my life. In fact, it's the exact opposite of that. These are the most committed Jesus followers on the planet, and they just went through the most fierce trial possible. And so Jesus is committed to us, to being with us in trials, but to using trials to shape us. No one is exempt. Trials teach us our limitations. And finally, Jesus must move in all of us from teacher to Lord of all. That's salvation. When you see Him as Lord, see Him as God, and put your trust in His finished work. Jesus then moves on a couple stories later, kind of round second and third, head for home. He has an encounter. In fact, he's going to have two encounters. One encounter happens within the other encounter, but look on over to chapter 5, verse 21. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, so now they're there, they've been saved. Here's what happened on the other side of that. A great crowd gathered about Him, and He was beside the sea. And then here comes one of the rulers of the synagogue, a guy named Jairus. As a ruler of the synagogue, he would have been a very powerful person, a very famous person. All would have known him. And here he comes and looks. It says, and seeing Jesus, Jairus fell at His feet. That's not a common sight to see, is this established person and leader falling at the feet of Jesus. So it begs the question, why is he so desperate? And Jairus implored Him, verse 23, earnestly, saying, my little daughter is at the point of death. How we know. Come and lay your hands on her, he says to Jesus, so that she may be made well and live. Please, Jesus, come heal my daughter. Now, as a man with two daughters, I felt this week getting ready for this, of what it would feel like, the hopelessness, the desperation of a 12-year-old daughter of mine dying in front of my eyes, how painful it must have been to be watching that, how even more painful it must have been to leave her to go try this last Hail Mary from this person you've heard can heal people, and that is Jesus. And so the emotional drama is almost unbearable, you might imagine, for Jairus. And lo and behold, verse 24, Jesus went with him. So amazingly, Jairus found Jesus, told him the scenario, and Jesus says, yeah, let's go. Jesus went with him, and it says a great crowd followed him, and then all of a sudden they get interrupted. Now I think about Jesus, I think about the person interrupting Jesus, I think about the disciples, I think about Jairus in this moment. Lots going on here emotionally. There was a woman who had an issue of blood for 12 years. Some parallels here. 12-year-old girl, this woman had an issue of blood for 12 years. The daughter has an acute problem, right? She's about to die. This other lady that encounters Jesus has a chronic problem. She suffered much under many physicians, spent all that she had, was no better but grew no worse. And so here's a desperate woman who is not just physically desperate, but you can imagine emotionally desperate, financially desperate. She spent everything to stop this bleeding, this issue of blood. She's also, you must know from the culture of that day, socially desperate. She would have been considered ceremonially unclean, unable to come to worship, unable to meet with priests, unable to have normal fellowship with the rest of her Jewish brothers and sisters. And so for 12 years, imagine the frustration of dealing with this and having to do that alone. But she had heard reports, verse 27, about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. For she said, if I touch his garment, I'll be made well. Some amazing faith. That, hey, if I can just touch Jesus. Now it would have been against every single taboo in her culture for her to touch Jesus, the rabbi, as an unclean person. But when she did that, immediately, verse 29, the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. It's unbelievable. Just touching his cloak. Again, we're seeing Jesus' power. But make note here, because here's the very essence of the gospel. When this unclean woman touched a clean Jesus, it didn't make the clean unclean, it made the unclean clean. She's healed. She came to Jesus and was healed. And Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my garment?" So again, she's going to force her to testify. She's going to have her call to account what happened. And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing around you, and yet you say, 'Who touched me?'" And he looked around to see who had done it. So the disciples are a little frustrated. You can imagine Jairus, right? He's probably really, really glad for this scenario, but he's got a dying daughter. And so Jesus is forcing him to be patient as he made his disciples be patient because he's in control of all of it. Because Jesus controls it all, you and I can be patient and trust him. And the woman, not knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. So she testifies about what I believed. If I would touch your garment, I'd be healed. I touched your garment and I'm healed. I'm the one. You just healed me. And he said to her in such kindness, "Daughter," it's the only time in the New Testament we see Jesus call somebody daughter. "Daughter, your faith has made you well." And he gives her this amazing blessing. "Go in peace, be healed of your disease." And Jairus' daughter, we see a father advocating for her. In this woman, we don't see that, but we see Jesus step in and call her daughter. And sure enough, if you're Jairus, you're thinking, "Man, this is great. I'm happy for her. But man, we got to get to my house because my daughter, I'm just hoping we get there in time." While Jesus was speaking, there came from Jairus' house someone who said, "Your daughter's dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" And again, notice that teacher again. But overhearing what they said, Jesus looked right at Jairus and said, "Do not fear, only believe." So Jesus gave him a powerful reinforcement. "Hey, Jairus, I know we just got this report. Trust me. Trust me." And when you and I can't trace his hand, which is most of the time, we can trust his heart. What I've learned in walking with him for a couple decades now is Jesus is rarely early, but never late. And when I can't trace his hand, I can trust his heart, that he's got it. He knows all things, can fix all things, can redeem all things because he's sovereign. And sure enough, he allowed no one except Peter, James, John, the brother of James. They came to the house of Jairus, and Jesus saw a commotion. Of course he did. People weeping and wailing loudly. And when he entered, he said to them, "Why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child's not dead, but sleeping." And when you're Jesus and you've conquered and defeated death, that's all it is for you. And they laughed at him, but he put them all outside, took the child's father and mother and those who were with him, and went into the child's room. And it's so tender, so precious. Taking her by the hand, he said to her, "Talitha kumai," which means little girl. It's literally like a slang word, like honey. "Here, honey, I say to you, rise up." And immediately the girl got up and began walking. She was 12 years old, and they were immediately overcome with amazement. And he strictly charged them that no one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat. And so in this encounter as well, both the disciples and Jairus, it cost them more than they could have ever imagined it would cost them to follow and trust in Jesus, but they got in reward more than that they could ever have imagined, exceedingly abundantly more than they ever could have imagined, that Jesus brought healing, brought his daughter back to life. Jesus has power to heal. Jesus has power over death. Imagine the relief of Jairus and his wife, the gratitude they would live with because of this moment. Notice in this, Jesus' tenderness. He held her hand. He whispers to her to get up. Make sure that she has something to eat. I hope for everyone in this room, that you have this kind of relationship with Jesus. That at some point you've put your faith, hope, and trust in Jesus. Jairus shows great faith here. The disciples turn to him as an act of faith. Save us. That's what salvation is. It's not cleaning your life up and reaching some level of morality that now you're more moral than most. And so when this is all over, you get to go to heaven and everybody else goes to hell. No. A relationship with Jesus has nothing to do with your work other than repenting of it and putting your faith, hope, and trust in Jesus. If you've crossed over that line of faith, maybe this morning you need to hear about some good gospel patience. Because what I know is I've lived long enough, every single one of us, either in a storm, coming out of a storm, or I hate to tell you, headed into a storm. And in that, God calls us to trust me, just like he did Jairus, looked him right in the eye. And I know we have trials all over this room. Jesus says the same thing, looks you right in the eye, trust me. Trust me, I am good and I do good. And Jesus always has all the variables. We always have very few of the variables, and we're called to trust. And that's the gift trials are to us. That when we get behind them and on the other side of them, we would say, I wouldn't wish that upon anybody, and I wouldn't trade that with anybody. Because it was in the midst of that that I learned an intimacy with my Savior, Jesus. Some of you do this so well. I learned so much watching you endure so much. That in the midst of the toughest things life can throw at us, I see you struggle well and be honest about that and walk with him. I hope these lessons, these encounters with Jesus, establishing himself as king, encourage you to persevere. We're going to turn to the tables, and what we celebrate is the fact, as this reminder each week, Jesus died for us. Like, that's what this represents. When he was in the upper room, he says, do this as often as you can until I return. So we stand on the shoulders of 2,000 years of Jesus followers who remind their heart that this whole thing is built on Jesus. That Jesus says, come to me all who are burdened and weary, and I will give you rest. And so this is the ultimate gospel rest. Jesus' body broken for us, his blood shed on our behalf that we might have life, that we might know him. And so we celebrate that. Just as that woman with the issue of the blood learned, I pointed it out. That's what becoming a Christian is, that we as the unclean move to the clean one, and we don't make Jesus unclean. Jesus makes us clean, and he heals us, and he sends us out on mission to testify of who he is. Martin Luther called that the great exchange. 1 Corinthians 58, Paul would say, he who knew no sin became sin, that we might become the righteousness of God. And so we celebrate the gospel. Father, thank you for these men and women in front of me. So many of them journeying through storms, and many of them have bruises and scars, can testify this morning of your faithfulness in the midst of storms. I pray for any that don't know you as Father, who aren't holding your hand as they face death at some point, that Father, just like that little girl, that today would be their day of salvation, that they would come to know the power and the personal relationship they can have with Jesus. For any in here whose storms have caused them to run from God and maybe create some bitterness or anger toward God, I pray that today would be a day of repentance, that relationship could be restored, that their next move would be to look back toward Jesus. For many in here, Lord, who are faithfully journeying, may today be a deep encouragement to keep going. We love you, Father. In Christ's name, amen. The way we do things here at Fellowship is we open the tables. There's some here. There's tables in the back. Create a little space for you to just visit with the Lord, deal with the Lord. Also an opportunity for repentance, opportunity to take communion. We'll have a prayer team to pray with you. And so we just create a few moments here. And then we'll sing and tell you a little bit about something going on this week and call it a morning. The tables are open.